Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Michael Johns, Senior Vice President at Kratos, about the latest in U.S. hypersonics development and whether the U.S. is in fact trailing behind adversaries such as China and Russia on hypersonic weapons. And then we dive into the latest developments on the Korean Peninsula, the unfolding legal battle over the future of TikTok, and whether there are serious cracks in the Russia-Iran relationship that the Trump administration may be able to exploit. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. The holidays are behind us, and we're heading full speed into what's going to be an extremely newsy first part of 2025. Inauguration Day just about 10 days away from now. We've got a lot to cover on today's show. A great interview coming up later with Michael Johns, a senior vice president of Kratos, about hypersonics. That's an issue that's really going to be important, especially as the Trump administration, as we all expect, really prioritizes U.S. homeland missile defense over the next couple of years. But before we get to all of that, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Yes, definitely interested in getting into this hypersonics weapons development piece in a few minutes, but frankly, it's great to be here for another week on the podcast. One thing on my radar is the question of what happens next for the China-owned social media giant TikTok. As we tape this, Ben, lawyers are preparing Supreme Court oral arguments for January 10 in TikTok's challenge to the new U.S. law ordering that the platform be sold from its China parent company, ByteDance, to a U.S. buyer or be banned on smartphones inside the United States. We're all interested in figuring out how that ban is going to work if it comes into effect. Now, it's of course going to take a little while for the Supreme Court to rule on this case, Ben, and one of the big questions is whether the justices will buy time by embracing President-elect Trump's request that the implementation of this TikTok ban be delayed. A couple of things as our listeners grapple with the TikTok news that is in the headlines this weekend and over the coming days. The first is the report that American investor Kevin O'Leary from the popular TV show Shark Tank has claimed that he's nearing a deal to buy TikTok. There's been a lot of speculation here, Ben. The Chinese Communist Party has said it won't approve any buyer of TikTok. Maybe that's changing. The CCP also sharply denies claims by U.S. analysts that ByteDance is linked to the CCP's Ministry of State Security and is used by Chinese intelligence to spy on and spread disinformation among unsuspecting American users of TikTok. Of course, Ben, some have argued that Elon Musk could be a buyer of TikTok, given that he already owns the social media platform X and that he has big business in China through one of his other companies, the electric vehicle maker Tesla. It's not clear what's going to happen here, Ben. We'll keep tracking it.
Yeah, that's a question that I wonder. The Elon Musk angle, is that conversation happening behind the scenes right now? Is Donald Trump privately pushing Elon Musk? Hey, why don't you get a few $1 billion or however much it's going to cost and go ahead and buy TikTok yourself? Because that might take care of problems for all of us at the same time.
I did ask U.S. Rep. Raja Krishnamurthy, an Illinois Democrat who was one of the authors of the legislation that became this TikTok ban law, whether or not he thought Musk could be a buyer or that the CCP would approve Musk. And he said he just didn't know. That was a couple of months ago. It's a very interesting interview, though, and people can easily find it by Googling Threat Status, Raja Krishnamurthy. It's out there on YouTube, Ben. But I want to get to another thing on my radar, and that was how outgoing Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited South Korea in recent days to show solidarity with this U.S. ally, which continues to go through major internal political tumult following the impeachment of its conservative president, Yoon Suk Yeol, who tried to impose martial law over the country last month on grounds that martial law would be needed to counter North Korean subterfuge, spying, and influence in South Korea. I think that Tony Blinken's visit showed the U.S. stands with South Korea at this difficult time. Interestingly, North Korea seized on the Secretary of State's visit by test launching what it said was a new hypersonic missile while Blinken was in Seoul. Again, listeners can go read all about that in Threat Status Ben. It was a brazen move by North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un at a moment when he's sent troops to back Russian forces in Ukraine, and he seems to have been emboldened by the political unrest in South Korea. We're all interested in finding out whether the incoming Trump administration tries to do some sort of diplomatic outreach with Kim Jong-un or what. Couple more quick things, Ben, on a separate front. I'm still tracking the New Orleans New Year's Day terror attack and the New Year's Day Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas. Time flies in the news, and the investigation into these two cases seems to have gone to the mainstream media's back burner pretty quickly. What caught my eye, Ben, was that two key Republicans on the House Homeland Security Committee, Mark Green and August Pfluger, they wrote a letter the other day to outgoing FBI Director Christopher Wray and outgoing Homeland Security Director Alejandro Mayorkas, demanding a briefing on what is known about the visits that Shamsuddin Jabbar, the New Orleans attacker, made to Egypt and to Canada before carrying out his New Year's Day attack in the name of the Islamic State terror group. Investigators say Jabbar acted on his own, but questions still swirl around his radicalization and whether or not he ever had any contact with any operatives of the group known as ISIS. In their letter, the GOP lawmakers also cited reports that Jabbar had explosive compounds that have never before been used in the U.S. or Europe. So that's pretty interesting. Finally, Ben, it caught my eye this week that the U.S. Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA, as it's known in the secretive world of nuclear weapons development, announced that America's primary nuclear gravity bomb, the B-61, has been fully modernized with a new precision guidance system. It's now the B-61-12. And for those who don't know, when I say gravity bomb, I just mean a bomb that can be dropped from an airplane. And I wanted to flag that as a national security item that didn't get much mainstream attention, but goes to show you that Washington is, in fact, upgrading America's nuclear weapons capabilities.
Yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on, that's for sure. One thing that jumped out to me here, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin today, as we're recording this Thursday, is in Germany, and he told reporters that the U.S. still needs to maintain its troop presence in Syria to prevent an ISIS resurgence. His comments seem to suggest that the new baseline for America's military footprint in Syria, at least right now, is 2,000, which is what it was as of a few weeks ago when the Pentagon more than doubled our presence as the Bashar Assad government was crumbling to a rebel alliance in Damascus. More on Assad in a second. But it's interesting from a political point of view because we now have a new president coming into office in less than 2 weeks and a new defense secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, who will be going through his Senate confirmation hearings just next week. Trump's made no secret he wants U.S. troops out of Syria. And now the outgoing defense secretary is publicly talking about how crucial they are to preventing this Islamic State resurgence in Syria, so we don't see more attacks here in the U.S. homeland from folks who are either radicalized abroad and travel here or recruited from an Islamic State base of operations in Syria. So the Defense Department, essentially, depending on how you want to read this, they defeated Donald Trump's attempt in his first term to fully withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. And it seems like some folks in the military establishment might be trying to do it again. So I think we'll have to keep a close eye on that to see if that actually comes to fruition or if Donald Trump proves himself to be a little bit more determined to follow through on that policy goal this time around with U.S. troops in Syria.
What about the Iran factor, Ben? I mean, there are reports that Iran has now pulled its proxies out of Syria. What do you make of just Iran's posture right now towards these developments?
Yeah, well, the relationship between Iran and Syria, and if you want to step back even further, Iran and Russia is something that's kind of on my radar. So I'm glad you brought that up. There's an interesting story out this week. The New York Times, quoting a key Iranian general, Behrouz Esbati, who apparently spoke at a mosque earlier this week, and a recording was leaked to some regional media. The New York Times did a translation of it. But apparently this general, Esbati, said that Iran had wanted to use Syria to open a new front against Israel, but that Assad essentially refused that request for the past year before Assad's government, of course, was overthrown last month. As Badi said, they asked repeatedly, and that because of the refusal by Assad, ties between those two countries, Iran and Syria, had become strained even before Assad was removed. So I think you're right to point out that Iran's posture in this is key, and it seems like the tensions between those two countries have been on the rise even before the most recent developments. But here's where it gets, I think, even more interesting, and or for the incoming Trump administration, maybe presents a bit of an opportunity. According to these media reports, based on the recording of this general, he accused Russia of shutting down radar systems in Syria during alleged Israeli attacks on Iranian resources there, the proxy groups that you just mentioned. That's according to the Times of Israel, which summed this up pretty nicely in an article today. The general also said that Russian jets were bombing empty deserts in Syria rather than actually targeting the rebel alliance as it was moving on Damascus. He said the Kremlin basically lied to Tehran about what it was doing, essentially giving them the idea that, yes, we are intervening on behalf of you guys and on behalf of Assad to stop the rebel alliance. And evidently, at least according to this general, that wasn't the case. So what does this mean for us? Why do we care about what's happening with the relationship between Iran and Syria and Russia? Listeners are used to us talking about the acts of authoritarians, Guy. And one thing you brought up recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, is this idea of a wedge strategy. Does the Trump administration try to strategically look for cracks in relationships between members of the alliance, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, probably Venezuela and Cuba now as well, and take advantage of them? It seems like there's some daylight here with respect to Syria in terms of what Iran and Russia might have wanted to see happen there. I mean, don't forget, Bashar Assad said that he was essentially forced to leave his own country by Russian troops. He's in Moscow now. We're a bit skeptical here of whether that's actually true or if he's trying to rewrite history. But nevertheless, maybe Iran wanted him to stay. To what degree was Iran involved, if at all, in Russian moves to shift its military resources around the country? Was there any coordination between those two sides, or was Iran essentially frozen out or even lied to? So this might just be one Iranian general kind of speaking off the cuff, Guy. I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but it's noteworthy to me because it's an example of the kind of thing that a Trump administration, in theory, through some crafty diplomacy and maybe just some good old-fashioned plain creativity, might be able to exploit. Have you gotten any indications, Guy, from your sources that you think maybe they're thinking that way before Inauguration Day?
Absolutely. I think the wedge strategy debate is very much alive among the foreign policy apparatus of the incoming administration, Ben, from what I'm hearing. I also took a big picture look at it with the historian Phil Zellico out at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. I was out there a couple months ago, and we made a video where we discussed this whole prospect of a wedge strategy, easily findable online. I hope our listeners will check it out and email me about their thoughts on it. Michael Johns is the Senior Vice President of Kratos SRE in Alabama. That is a special division of the San Diego-based Kratos Defense and Security Solutions, an advanced defense tech company that's been in the news in recent days because it's been awarded a $1.5 billion Pentagon contract to support its multi-service advanced capability hypersonic testbed MACH-TB program. This is a big deal in the great power battle for dominance over hypersonic weapons. Michael Johns, you're an engineer, an expert on rockets and space. Thank you so much for joining the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, great, guy. Thanks for including us.
First of all, what is the MACH-TB program? Help us unpack it in terms that listeners outside the world of advanced weapons tech might understand. Are we talking literally about developing missiles capability that can just go way past the speed of sound?
Yeah, I mean, so whenever you're talking about hypersonic weapons, you're automatically talking about things that are moving at greater than Mach 5, right? So these are all advanced technology, advanced weapon systems, flight systems. Doesn't have to be a weapon system. The limiting factor on how we're developing and fielding weapon systems right now is our ability to test them affordably and at cadence where you can rapidly advance technologies. And that's really what the Mock TB program is about. It's like, how do we change the game, change the paradigm on testing of hypersonic weapons, which are complex, right? These are, when you start flying at these kinds of speed, and when we're talking about, greater than Mach 5, it could be much greater than Mach 5, right? And that gets very complex. And so what that is it's basically a new way of testing of how do you take the each individual hypersonic test and bring it down an order of magnitude lower cost and be able to test an order of magnitude more tests per year than we're currently doing in the United States.
So will Kratos actually be firing projectiles, essentially missile tests with this?
Yeah, I mean these are all flight tests. So this is not ground tests. We all have. I mean, the whole testing regime of testing hypersonic weapon systems and missile systems, or even space flight systems, is you start on the ground. You do laboratory based things. You go up to ground tests, and then you go to flight tests, and then you have a fully developed system over a number of flight events and so forth. And this is the flight test program for that, which is how do we do it in a low cost way? But you're shooting rockets, right?
Why is this so important right now? You've said before, I think you were quoted in a press release in the past few days, that the U.S. is at this critical point in the need for rapid and affordable hypersonic flight testing. But why is it so critical right now?
Well, we're in a great race, right? We're great with the great powers in the world about how we're going to develop and field these different systems. And it's offensive and defensive capabilities, right? It's not just how you're going to build the best weapon system or the best flight system, but it's how you're going to defeat them too. And it's no secret. You look at what's going on in Ukraine. You see what is in the open media right now about the different systems being fielded across the globe, and the U.S. is doing a lot of good work too. And we're going to show it with the Mock TV program.
Michael, it's Ben Wolfgang. To follow up on that, if you could, because you're in a unique position, I think, that to help listeners understand this, and that's where the U.S. actually does stand right now with hypersonics, vis-a-vis our adversaries, China, Russia in particular. You will watch congressional hearings or other events and hear people just throw around, oh, we're so far behind. We've had guests on the podcast. I think even last week someone said we've taken a 15-year holiday or something to that effect, on hypersonics research as opposed to China and Russia. Is that overblown? Are we actually far behind, or is this just kind of falling victim to politics and hyperbole sometimes?
No, I think the U.S. is not necessarily behind, but it's a race to keep up and catch up and stay ahead. I mean, we're the world's greatest superpower, right? As far as military dominance and the most advanced weapon systems and so forth, and we got to keep pace. And in order to keep pace, these systems are expensive to develop and deploy, and you have to look at alternate ways of going about the problem, and that is not only in the development of these systems, but the testing of these systems and so forth. And so it's the reason that you probably have heard from other folks about why we might be behind or why we've had a vacation or whatever it is the defense industry is very cyclical in how we fund things. And the industrial base, has to do a lot of different things in order to develop our weapon systems that we're trying to develop, right? So, and it's the same industrial base that's doing hypersonics, that's doing strategic nuclear stuff, right? So it's all the same. So, it's all the same smart people, right, that are doing these different things. Mm-hmm. And so, but the U.S. is doing well, but we need. I think the best thing that the U.S. can do is focus, sustain funding in these areas so that we don't have gaps in capability, right? We don't have entire years, multiple years where we're not putting the funding that we need into these research and development for these advanced systems.
Michael, why is hypersonic development so costly? Give us a sense or a little bit of an insight into the challenges that a company like Kratos faces. You mentioned some of the defense funding issues, and we talk about that a lot on Threat Status, but also technically here. I mean, we're really talking about rocket science.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive because it's a hard problem. So, and the problem gets harder the faster you go. And when you're talking about hypersonic systems in particular, if not to get too technical, but if you think about what a typical ballistic missile system is, which goes way out of their atmosphere and then comes back through, it's in challenging aerothermal heating conditions, environmental conditions, but it's not as challenging as flying through the atmosphere like you have to do with the hypersonic weapon system. And so the material challenges alone and in the guidance and control challenges with these systems are immense. And so it's anytime there's a very hard problem, it's costly to solve those problems. So from a material standpoint, from a guidance and control standpoint, from you name it, as far as the technologies. And what the U.S. does that other countries don't do necessarily is, we want to be very precise with what we do, right? So on how things fly and where they hit and other things like that. So.
Michael, I wanted to ask about sort of the security of U.S. hypersonics research technology, intellectual property. Back in 2019, I was at Purdue University to see the Mach 6 quiet tunnel, which I think is a Boeing and an Air Force Office of Scientific Research project. And there's a lot of concern today, as you well know, about foreign students or foreign researchers, coming to the U.S. and having access to projects like that, whether it's on a college campus or somewhere else. So, I don't want to ask you on this podcast to set what U.S. policy should be about foreign students in research and classification levels of DoD projects. But from where you sit, are you confident that we collectively, as the United States, academia, the private defense industry, the Pentagon, the federal government, Kratos, are you confident that all the necessary protections are in place to make sure that as this progress is being made on hypersonics, that our adversaries aren't stealing our work?
Yeah, I mean, that gets outside of my expertise very quickly, but I think that the U.S. is doing a lot right now on how to protect that information. And frankly, it's one of the contrary to what we're doing right now on this podcast, one of the best ways to do that is to stop talking about it, right, in open environments. And I think that's where we're doing more and more in the industry, is just like, if we're going to talk about what we're doing, let's do it in closed environments only. And so I think that's really what you got to do. But we all know that everybody's doing everything they can do to figure out how to get other people's technology, right? So we know that the U.S. is a target every time. We know that Kratos is a target. We know that personally we have to conduct our lives like we're targets of trying to get this information. So it's just how it is.
Michael, you mentioned cyclical Defense Department funding. I wonder if you can give us some insider perspective on what you see as the way forward to overcome those challenges when it comes to investment in R&D in hypersonic development. Is it possible that there's some kind of hybrid private investment model that's out there that could come to the fore? Or does the Defense Department just need more money faster and a better acquisition system that can just move the ball forward on this?
Yeah, I think, it's a complex question. It's a complex answer to that. I would say that, first and foremost, where we are right now, the development of systems, hypersonic developed systems, whether it's space, whether it's offensive, defensive weapon systems, is sustained and growing RDT&E funding within the various federal budgets, whether it's within basic science or whether it's in the services budgets, DARPA, wherever that is. Robust funding in general helps build and accelerate these kinds of systems. You're seeing a lot of private equity come to the table right now and investing in companies that are early stage hypersonics technologies. I think that's great. What can drive more of that is in the procurement strategy, I think, for the systems, right? So it's like, if you can bridge multiple years with high demand signal for these kinds of systems, then companies can make investment decisions on how to scale up to handle everything you need to do for developing and fielding hypersonic systems. If you're getting a 1-year demand signal in a procurement or a less than certain demand signal, then companies simply aren't going to put the necessary capital in order to go do that. unless they are forward-leaning companies, and Kratos is one of those companies, right? So we kind of see the industry, others do too, but Kratos sees that industry, right? And we see the potential demand, and we're kind of known for leaning in and doing the investments in ahead of need on some of these things, and wait for the market to catch it. But you've probably had multiple podcasts on the procurement systems and the acquisition strategies and so forth related to that. It's not a problem that gets solved in 1 year or one administration.
On the funding question, Michael, are we striking the right balance now between money for offensive hypersonic capabilities versus defensive hypersonic capabilities? I assume a lot more money is being spent on the offensive side of things. Do we need to beef up the defensive side, or do you think the right balance roughly is being struck right now?
I think we need more funding everywhere.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think offensive is underfunded, and I think defensive is underfunded. And if we're gonna do what we need to do in the pace that we need to do it, we need to put a lot more money into the problem.
How hard is the defensive side of this equation? I mean, just for the layperson out there listening who's not familiar with it, I mean, we're talking about, as Guy said, literal rocket science and some of the most advanced, weapons systems in the world. So you're talking about something defensive to defeat that from a technical point of view. How hard of a problem is that to solve?
Well, I mean, it's hard, right? But it's all dependent on how fast, right? So defeating something at Mach 5, which is technically hypersonic, is a little bit easier than defeating something at Mach 15. And it depends on how things are moving through, what trajectory they're on and so forth, and when you can see it, when you can start taking some sort of a kill chain action on that, and so forth. But it is a hard problem, and we're not developing. Kratos is not developing and fielding defensive systems, so there are experts out there that can talk defensive all day long.
Michael Johns from Kratos SRE, a special division of the San Diego-based Kratos Defense and Security Solutions. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Weekly podcast.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate you hosting me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically in the U.S., or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you all are listening to the show, Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
With all this talk, Ben, about nuclear weapons, and then now hypersonics, with Michael Johns in this last segment, my Threat of the Week is that increased global geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and adversaries, China, Russia, and Iran, also North Korea to a certain degree, mean that the very delicate tissue of diplomacy that can help to contain things like a hypersonic missile race or the nuclear arms race has broken down in a way that finds both of those races dangerously accelerating. And the threat of hypersonic missile war or nuclear war remains a very real thing in the world, Ben, and that's my Threat of the Week.
Yeah, it's interesting when you read some, Pentagon documents and national defense strategies and things like missile defense analyses, you quickly realize that, the defense strategy is largely predicated on deterrence and the idea that hopefully our adversaries are afraid that we'll hit them just as hard or harder than they hit us. And that's what defense essentially boils down to. So that's something we'll get into, I know, more on future episodes of the Threat Status Podcast. My Threat of the Week, Guy, is wildfires. And of course, we have to talk on this week's show about the terrifying scenes out of California right now outside Los Angeles, where raging wildfires, multiple fires burning out of control, scorching the Pacific Palisades, threatening Hollywood Hills, and they just seem to keep growing. And as we're recording this, the fires haven't been contained. More than 2,000 structures destroyed, at least 5 people are dead. And there's nothing I can say here in the podcast, an audio medium to convey how apocalyptic the situation looks. So the photos and videos kind of speak for themselves. Unsurprisingly, politics is already a part of the story, as President-elect Trump is blaming California Governor Gavin Newsom for some of the issues at play here. But we'll save that discussion for a different day. But Guy, one thing I do want to keep in mind, and that our listeners should also keep in mind, wildfires are getting more destructive. And when we talk about things like climate change and related issues, we're talking about extreme weather. This is getting worse because of things like higher winds or fires happening at different times of year that make it easier for them to spread. So that's what we're talking about. It's not necessarily the world's getting hotter and therefore we have more fires. It's certainly a bit more complicated than that. And I could spend, an hour or multiple episodes going over statistics about the wildfires. But here's just one quickly that jumped out to me when I was researching this earlier today. And this is from the National Centers for Environmental Information. From January through November of last year, 8.1 million acres burned due to wildfires. The average from 2001 through 2020 for that same time period was 6.8 million. So you can do the math on that. And while the number of fires can vary for the same time period last year, January to November, there was an average of 157 acres burned per fire. The previous average from 2001 to 2020 was just 110 acres burned per fire. So I can go on and on, but the bottom line is, as we're seeing with the LA fires right now, they're getting more destructive, they're spreading more quickly, and they're harder to contain. There are a bunch of reasons for that we can discuss more in depth later. But for right now, Guy, and especially for the people of California, that's my threat of the week.
Ben, when I was out in California at the Reagan National Defense Forum 1 month ago, I actually rented a bicycle, a road cycle, and I rode it along the coast right up to Pacific Palisades, just north of Santa Monica. And that area has now burned to the ground, Ben. It's mind-boggling. I'm pretty saddened by it, and I feel and pray for the people who've lost their homes and businesses there.
Well, thank you all so much. Huge thanks to Michael Johns for coming on the Threat Status podcast to talk to us about hypersonics. And thank you all very much for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share the podcast with all your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week.